Hi, Sean here, and welcome to this skill where we're going to be taking a look at some fundamental concepts and terms in the world of software testing with Python. And really, the most important concept that we're going to talk about is the first, the first one that we're going to talk about in this video here, and that is what is software testing in the first place? Well, it's probably easiest to explain this just by use of some simple examples. Software testing is really an absolutely critical part of any kind of quality software product. So, in order to demonstrate this, let's say that you're working for let's just make it fun and say that you're working for some kind of startup and you're creating a new software product. And let's just assume that you're using Python, right? Obviously, since this is a Python software testing course, that's probably not too unreasonable of an assumption. All right, so let's say that you're creating a new application. Maybe it's something like I don't know, it could be a social network, for example, where you can see what's going on in people's lives, something like that. Well, for the first few days that you're working on your app, this app is going to be fairly manageable, right? You're going to start off probably with, just creating a few basic functions, right? So you might have just a few functions in your application, maybe a few classes, maybe a few scripts, things like that. And whenever you make a change to the code in your application, right? Whenever you change, let's say that you make a change to this function here, you can make sure that that change didn't affect the application, too severely by simply going through and testing to make sure that the rest of these functions and classes and things like that still work. Right? In other words, every time you make a change, you can simply click through your application. It obviously depends on what type of application you're creating, but you can usually test these applications manually pretty easily while they're small. However, as time goes on and you add more and more functions and more classes and more scripts to your application, and the relationships between all of these functions get more and more complex, right? Maybe this one, uses that one, etc. Well, it's going to become exponentially more difficult to make sure that every incremental change doesn't break something somewhere else in the application. And the normal result of this, of course, is that every incremental feature or change that you want to make to your application becomes harder and harder and harder until you reach a point of the point that I kind of think of as the point of stagnation in an application, where the amount of time required to just maintain the application and fix bugs and stuff like that is equal to the amount of time that the developers on your team have in a day, right? So that's the point of stagnation, as I like to think of it. That's not a technical term here, but I think it's kind of it's a handy shadow to have kind of looming on the horizon there when when you're considering whether or not to add tests to your application. And it can really lead to the point where you're not able to really add anything new to an application for the foreseeable future. I've certainly worked at companies where that's been the case. I won't name any names, but it's definitely a very real possibility. All right, so the idea of software testing then is instead of your application being something that you have to test manually for every change you make, or worse yet, just kind of making a change and throwing it out into the void and hoping that your users will find any bugs for you, right? That's definitely something that a lot of companies out there do. The idea is that what you can do is you can actually write code. And here, we'll just assume that this is our social network application or whatever you might be working on. The idea here is that we can actually write code in Python that will automatically test all of the changes that we make in our application, right? So instead of us having to go through our social network application, try adding a friend, try removing a friend, try changing your info, just to make sure that everything still works, we simply write Python programs that will do that sort of thing for us. Now, the thing that I've mentioned there might sound a little bit complex. It might sound a little bit like web crawling. And while that's certainly a type of testing, right, that would be something more on the scale of end-to-end testing, which is that's something that we'll talk about in much more detail in a later skill. In many cases, the tests you write can be as granular as simply testing an individual function, right? So if you have a function called something like add, and that's supposed to take two numbers and return the sum of those numbers, well, you can obviously test this manually by writing a little script that will allow you to enter in one number and then another number and then show you the result, right? That would be sort of the manual way of testing that. Or you could simply write another file that will load that function in and make sure that its results match your expectations, right? So add 1 and 2, that should be 3, right? And you can actually, as we'll see again in later skills, there is a whole set of tools that different Python modules provide for making sure that things like this actually happen, right? To make sure that our assumptions are actually met in our code base. So again, that is the ultimate idea of software testing, and the ultimate goal of software testing is to give us much more reliable and fast insight into how well our application is working, in particular, after we make changes to it, right? So again, if you make a change to the add function, right, if you add some sort of extra functionality to it, you want to make sure that any function that uses this add function still works as well. So you'd want to have tests for those as well. If you have, maybe an average function or something like that uses this add function behind the scenes, you'll probably want to have code that tests this average function to make sure that, say, the average of 1, 2, and 3 is 2, right? So again, that's the basic idea of software testing, and if you want a more concrete definition, this is just kind of my definition that I use for software testing. It's a little bit more general than what we just discussed here, but I think it'll be a helpful thing to keep in mind going forward. My definition of software testing is a process, and ideally an automated process, but I won't put that as part of my definition, to verify that an application, right, I'll just write an app, meets the requirements. These would be the requirements that, someone on your team specifies, or maybe that are decided on in some meeting, and is free of defects, okay? We'll talk about defects in much more detail shortly, but that's kind of my basic working definition for software testing. And notice that this doesn't, as I said, make any mention of automated testing. So technically, when you go through and point and click on your application, if you've created a social network app or something like that, technically going through this and pointing and clicking, if you have a process to follow, that technically is testing software. But in this course, we're going to use the term software testing to refer almost exclusively to testing that's done in a more automated or programmatic manner, right? So essentially writing Python programs that will run those tests for us instead of having a human sit there all day and point and click and make sure different things work. Right now, that does have that definitely does have its own merits, right? Having someone who's actually manually testing this thing, but you do not want that as your only safeguard against defects making their way into your production application. So anyway, that is the basics of software testing. And really just now that we've come up with a concrete definition of software testing, I just want to be super explicit here about the importance of testing. There's really two main goals of software testing. The first goal is to ensure three main things, and those are reliability. All right, so the application should work in a fairly reliable manner. Performance, so the application should meet performance expectations, right? It shouldn't take, 10 minutes for something to happen when a user clicks a button. And security. This one we're not going to be talking about too much in this course because honestly, it's it could take up many courses on its own. But this one's important as well, right? Having automated tests to make sure that your application is secure. Okay, so that's the first important goal of software testing, is to ensure reliability, performance, and security. The second goal here is to reduce the risk of failure, or ideally eliminate failure in production environments, right? I'm just going to write that as in prod. Essentially just meaning that when you release this application and users are actually interacting with it in the wild, so to speak, right? When you publish a website or when you publish a Python desktop application, something like that, you want to eliminate the risk of that application crashing or just not working like it should from the point of view of a user. So those are really the two main goals of software testing, and we'll be referencing these going forward in many other skills. So anyway, hopefully this has given you a good orientation to what software testing is in the first place. What we're going to do in the next few videos is we're going to drill down a little bit deeper into some of these concepts. So I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.